First and foremost, though, I do want to say thank you for inviting me. It's been about 10 years since I've been to Peterborough, so it's wonderful to get back. It's a beautiful area. We got into town about 3 hours ago. Had a chance to tour around. It was just a gorgeous day, so that was great. And we're spending the night. We're going to tour around again tomorrow and check out the Canoe Museum, I believe it's called. So I'm keen to do that.
Absolutely.
And also, I will say this, I'm hoping that I can provide some insight on the topic that I'm talking about. But I've been in the four walls of the building now for about an hour. And what's happening here with the two academic institutions, representation from the private sector, other economic development groups, coming together on a common theme to talk about innovation, commercialization, entrepreneurship, believe it or not, it's actually unique. You might take it for granted, there might be an air of complacency among many organizations, but just the fact that you're talking is a huge sign, especially in a regional area of about 75,000 people. Now, what I'm hoping I might provide some insight on are what are you talking about and are you getting business done? So if I provide some insights in that area, hopefully you'll take this away and it'll be interesting. So, I want to set some context first. Some of this is a bit cliche, but you can appreciate the amount of uncertainty that we're currently operating in. We're just coming out of one of the largest financial crises since the Great Depression. There's uncertainty as to what you can believe in the stock markets. There's social unrest in many parts of the world. And it's almost become cliche, but it's truer now than ever, that innovation is the key to our future economic and social well-being, prosperity, success, however you want to define it. That is true and very, very rarely debated. But amongst this uncertainty and coinciding with this statement, there is something that's a little bit different that has been trending. There is absolutely a renewed sense of urgency to buy into innovation as our key driver of success. Our premier, the founder of the Ministry of Research and Innovation, X number of years ago, a designated ministry focused on converting research and innovation to commercial outcomes. Dedicated ministry. We look at the major surveys of major CEOs of global companies, Canadian companies, doesn't matter where they are. The top 3 challenges are things that keep them up at night, always within the top 3, how do we be more innovative? How do we maintain that global competitiveness? It's always been there, but from a trending perspective, there's a lot more concern that in Canada especially, and in Ontario, that it's becoming more astute, that we need to be more focused on that. So I don't want to be all gloom and doom, but the reality is we are still continuing to lose ground. There's a lot of investments being made in every major industry, be it the Public Policy Forum, be it the Conference Board of Canada. The major industries, irrespective of what parameters they measure, are all citing that innovation game, we're not doing that well yet. And it's the innovation, conversion to commercialization where we really fall down. Exceptional research institutions, but converting this innovation into tangible, material, economic, and social outcomes is still problematic. And moving towards how we're going to solve that is becoming exceptionally different than what it was 5, 10, 15 years ago. And to put things even in a broader context, I had the opportunity to attend a conference about 2 weeks ago on Africa. And it might surprise you that the contribution to GDP in Africa as a whole from entrepreneurship is 3 times higher than it is in Canada. I'm talking Africa. We're not talking about China, we're not talking about India, we're not talking about Singapore, we're not talking about any of those countries. Just as a baseline context, the contribution to GDP in Africa is 3 times higher than it is in Canada. How is that possible? What are we missing? What's different here culturally? What's different here from a social infrastructure perspective? One would argue that we have a lot more, so maybe, what are we missing? And it was really opening to me that I just had never really put that in perspective. And then you retreat and you say, okay, things have really, really changed. So it's no surprise that, we continue to compete, we continue to invest, we continue to, really understand that in order to be successful, we got to step up our game. Again, a bit cliche, a bit redundant, everyone knows that. But who we compete against and how we compete has got to change. This interregional competition, especially that you see in Toronto, between even the sub-jurisdictions within the broader metropolitan area competing against each other, it's redundant. It doesn't make sense. There's a global game out there, and the competition of new economy, and high wealth individual jobs, and things related to that, It's a very different mindset than it was 5, 10 years ago. So this idea of competing and playing, sure, it's great. But now there needs to be that paradigm shift that we have to win. And we have to win at the global level. How are we going to do that? So there lies the question. How do we compete? How do we compete when we have one really glaring challenge? Amongst others, but one really glaring challenge. We have a huge expanse of land. We have 30-some-odd million people. And one of the lowest population densities in the world. That is a barrier. That is a barrier. Why? Because innovation typically drives from density, ideation. You bring a cluster together in a room, there's probably a ton of ideas and discussions and partnerships and collaborations that occur within these four walls. But you magnify that to the macro level, and you look at Canada as a whole, and you have these broad, desperate, what I'll call hub cities that are still isolated. So the ability to connect and leverage assets and resources and skills among all these different individuals is actually problematic in many respects. Yes, we have technologies. Yes, we have Skype. Yes, we have Twitter. Yes, we have Facebook. We have mechanisms where we can do video conferencing. Sure, but it's still problematic. And you contrast that with Mumbai or Shanghai or all these other regions. And again, if you extrapolate that to the research park models that happen in a lot of the Asian countries, there are research parks in China that have populations almost the size of Ontario. Just a research park. They live there, they work there, they have boundaries around it. That's their research park. And for those who have traveled to China or Japan, you see these things. Then you come back home and you see smaller jurisdictions fighting over who's going to put up their lemonade stand and how are they going to do that rather than working together and bringing this density together. So it becomes a bit problematic from just purely from a geographical perspective and how we actually compete. But it also really emphasizes the fact that yes, competition is inherent. Yes, competition is good. Yes, it's going to drive new innovation amongst our own local communities. But I choose my words carefully when I think about contribution to GDP at the national level. Just to contrast this, we have the U.S. at 300 million, India at 1.1, and China at 1.3 billion. Why bother competing against each other in our local regions? It doesn't make sense. There has to be that collaborative element to push it forward. And one of the pet peeves that we see on the regional level, within Canada, we have this almost national sport of the provinces competing against each other rather than collaborating. And then when you take a step back, like 33 million, it's a rounding error for India and China. And I don't want to paint a picture of pure doom and gloom, but it just puts in perspective. And again, if you think of the trend I mentioned at the onset about this sense of urgency, in the last 10 years, people are saying, okay, wait a minute, these developing countries are creating research parks bigger than the number of people in their province. There's going to be a lot of smart people. They're going to be pushed together by virtue of walking across the hall. They're going to take an idea. They're going to take it to a prototype. They're going to get a concept that gets to the market, and they're going to have larger access to markets. Okay, we don't really have that. So how are we going to win? So that's a good segue to my next slide. So it's not all doom and gloom. Oh, thanks. It's not all doom and gloom, but I often, when I get to this slide, and we have a small group, but I won't put you on the spot here, I inevitably ask the question when I travel to various jurisdictions, primarily in North America, a lot in the US, I've done a few international, but when I get to this point, I'll ask the question, so how do you think we compete as a region, taking Peterborough as an example, of 75,000 people, 2 academic institutions, various economic development groups, various education-oriented groups. How do you compete to win? What can you do? And it's very often the question, you'll kind of get a stale answer, and you're thinking, well, I have 2 or 3 ideas. And then you engage in a further discussion, you realize there's probably a lot that we can do. But what's really interesting are the organizations, the regions that you then ask, what are you good at? Does everyone know in this region what you're really, really good at? And, I'll just put it down here. And if you don't understand what you're really good at, it becomes problematic as to maybe that should drive some of your strategy. Because you can take it 2 ways. What are you good at? Leverage that and focus on that. Let that be your strategy. Or you can have the conundrum where you say, we really want to be good at that and build towards it. And if you don't know those answers, it becomes very challenging.